The first time I saw Damien Moretti kneel, I realized power had nothing to do with who bought you and everything to do with who could make a room hold its breath. 10 men in dark suits stood around us without speaking, their eyes fixed on the marble floor like they already understood that one wrong glance could change their lives. The city lights behind the 12-foot windows turned the glass black, reflecting all of us back like ghosts trapped inside that penthouse. 3 months earlier, I had been the girl people pitied, the one who got traded to settle a debt she never made. But on that night, nobody looked at me with pity. They looked at me like they were trying to figure out how I had become the most dangerous person in the room. Damien was still wearing the kind of suit that made other men straighten their shoulders when he walked in. Charcoal wool, no tie, the top button open like he had bigger things to worry about than appearances. He kept one hand braced against his knee and tilted his head just enough to meet my eyes. He did not look afraid. Men like Damien Moretti did not scare easily. That was what made the moment hit even harder. He looked careful, respectful, even, like he understood that the next words out of my mouth would decide which future everyone in that room was about to live through. I remember tightening my fingers around the edge of the leather chair, not because I was nervous anymore, but because I needed to feel something solid under my hand. The air smelled like cedar, expensive cologne, and rain coming in off the Hudson. Somewhere far below us, Manhattan was still moving, traffic lights changing, cabs honking, strangers ordering late dinners, people living ordinary lives while an empire waited for my answer on the 63rd floor. If you had told me on the night I was sold that this was where I would end up, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I thought the story was simple. A desperate man signed me away to save himself. A powerful man took me because he could. End of story. But nothing about Damien was simple, and nothing about me stayed the same once I walked into his world. By the time he knelt in front of me, I knew the truth nobody else in that room wanted to say out loud. He had not lost control in one dramatic second. He had handed me pieces of it little by little. Every time he underestimated what I noticed, every time he let me stand a little closer, every time he assumed survival was the only thing I wanted. It wasn't. Survival is what you beg for when your life is being decided by other people. Power is what you learn to want when you finally understand the rules were never written for you in the first place. Damien's voice, when it came, was low enough that the others had to lean into the silence to hear it. He said my name like it belonged at the head of the table, not at the end of a bargain. And that was the moment I understood something even more dangerous than revenge. The man who once owned everything had just taught the whole room to wait for me. 3 months earlier, I was standing under the cold white lights of a private garage in Brooklyn, trying not to let my face show how badly my hands were shaking. My stepfather, Raymond Carter, stood half a step ahead of me with the same tired sport coat he wore to family dinners and court hearings and every other place he had ever gone to make excuses sound respectable. He would not look at me. That should have been the first sign that whatever was about to happen had already been decided. Outside, rain tapped against the metal door in a slow, steady rhythm, and the air smelled like concrete, motor oil, and the kind of expensive cigarettes rich men pretend they do not smoke. I was 24 years old, born and raised in New Jersey, with a community college degree, a stack of unpaid bills, and just enough faith left in people to still be surprised by betrayal. Raymond kept wiping his palms on his slacks like he could rub the panic off. He had told me we were meeting a lawyer. Then he said it was a business associate. Then he stopped explaining altogether. By the time the black SUV rolled in and its headlights swept across the floor, I knew the truth had to be worse than anything he had admitted out loud. 2 men stepped out first, both in dark coats, both too calm to be ordinary security. They did not touch me. They did not need to. The kind of authority they carried made the room feel smaller. Then Damien Moretti got out of the back seat, and for one strange second, I forgot to be afraid because he did not look like the monster I had spent the last 20 minutes inventing in my head. He looked composed, sharp, controlled, early 30s, maybe, broad shoulders under a tailored coat, dark hair brushed back, expression unreadable. The most unsettling thing about him was not that he seemed cruel. It was that he seemed disciplined, like he had built his entire life on never wasting a word or a gesture. His eyes moved from Raymond to me and stayed there just long enough to let me know I was the real subject of the meeting. Raymond cleared his throat and tried to sound casual, which only made him sound smaller. He started talking about payments, obligations, time, and second chances. He spoke in vague circles, like if he avoided the ugliest words, they would somehow become less true. Damien listened without interrupting. When Raymond finally ran out of sentences, Damien asked one question in a voice so even it made my stomach drop. He asked if Raymond was certain this was the agreement he wanted to make. Not needed to make. Wanted to make. I turned to Raymond so fast my heels clicked against the concrete. That was when he finally looked at me, and I saw it plain on his face. Shame, relief, and cowardice all at once. He had offered me up to settle what he owed, and somewhere in his mind he had decided that counted as survival. I expected Damien to step closer, to issue some command, to make the whole thing feel as ugly as it was. Instead, he did something far worse. He looked at me directly and asked if I understood where I was going. No one had asked what I wanted. No one had bothered pretending I had a choice. But the question still landed like a test. I lifted my chin and said no. His gaze did not soften, but something shifted there, some private calculation I could not read. Then he told me I would be taken somewhere safe, that nobody in his house would disrespect me, and that, from this moment on, my life would depend on how quickly I learned the rules. Safe. It was such a clean, polished word for a night that felt like my whole world had just been signed away. One of the men opened the back door of the SUV, and Raymond whispered my name like he expected me to comfort him. I did not. I looked at Damien instead, because I already understood something Raymond never had. Men who beg are easy to read. Men who stay calm when everyone else is desperate are the ones you have to watch. And as I slid into that car with rain streaking the windows and Manhattan waiting across the river like another country, I had the sickening feeling that I was not being driven toward the end of my life. I was being delivered to the beginning of someone else's plan. The drive into Manhattan felt longer than it should have, even though Brooklyn was disappearing behind us mile by mile, and the skyline kept getting closer through the rain. I sat in the back seat with my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles hurt, watching water race across the tinted window and trying to memorize every turn as if that could give me some control. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes. The driver kept his eyes on the road. The man in the passenger seat answered one phone call in a voice too low for me to make out more than a few clipped words. Damien sat across from me in the rear-facing seat, one arm resting along the door, looking more like a man coming home from a meeting than someone who had just changed the course of another person's life. That calm was starting to get under my skin. I had spent years around messy men, loud men, men who filled every room with excuses and anger and need. Damien was none of those things. He did not fidget. He did not explain himself. He did not even seem curious about whether I was frightened, which somehow made him harder to understand. Finally, as we crossed the bridge and the city rose around us in streaks of gold and steel, I asked the question I had been holding in since the garage. I asked him why me. He looked at me for a second, not surprised that I had found my voice, only measuring whether I deserved an answer. Then he said, "Because your stepfather offered what he thought I would value." The words landed hard, not because they were cruel, but because they were clean. No lies, no fake sympathy, just truth stripped down to the bone. I asked him if he planned to keep me there like some kind of collateral. He said, "That depends on how quickly you understand the difference between being trapped and being protected." I almost laughed at that. Protected was the kind of word powerful people used when they wanted gratitude for control. But before I could answer, the car turned beneath a private entrance on the Lower East Side and disappeared into an underground ramp guarded by cameras and polished steel gates. By the time the elevator carried us up, my heartbeat had settled into something colder and steadier. Panic only helps until you realize nobody in the room benefits from it except the people already in charge. The penthouse doors opened onto a space so quiet it almost felt staged. All dark wood, cream stone, soft lamps, and windows stretching from floor to ceiling with the East River glittering beyond them. It did not look like the center of an empire built on fear. It looked like the kind of place featured in magazines, where every chair cost more than my car and every surface was too clean to belong to ordinary life. A woman in a navy dress was already waiting near the foyer. She introduced herself as Elena and told me she would show me my room, explain the house schedule, and make sure I had whatever I needed. Her voice was warm without being familiar, practiced in a way that made me think she had guided more than one frightened stranger through these halls. I looked at Damien, expecting him to add some warning or set of conditions. But he only shrugged off his coat and said, "Learn the house. Learn the people. Speak carefully until you know who is listening." Then he started to walk away. I should have stayed quiet. I should have followed Elena and accepted that the rules would reveal themselves when they wanted to. Instead, I asked the question I should have been too scared to say out loud. I asked him what would happen if I refused to play along. He stopped near the windows, his reflection thrown back at us against the black glass of the city, and turned just enough for me to see the edge of his expression. Not anger, not amusement, something more unsettling than either. Respect, maybe, for asking. Then he said, "Evelyn, the smartest person in this house is never the loudest one." And with that, he left me standing in a penthouse that did not feel like a prison, yet did not feel like safety either, wondering why the man who could have treated me like a debt had chosen instead to speak to me like I might become a problem worth planning for. My room was bigger than the apartment I grew up in, and that was the first thing that made me angry enough to stop feeling sorry for myself. The bed looked untouched, the sheets crisp and white, the windows facing the river wide enough to make the whole city feel like a display built for someone else's pleasure. There were fresh clothes laid out in the closet in my size, shoes lined up beneath them, a bathroom stocked with products I had only ever seen behind locked glass at department stores, and a tray on the kitchen counter with tea, fruit, and a handwritten note from Elena that said breakfast was served at 7 and dinner at 8 unless Mr. Moretti requested otherwise. It was all so thoughtful, so carefully arranged, that it almost made the situation easier to hate. A cage lined with velvet was still a cage. I did not sleep much that first night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Raymond standing in that garage with his head lowered like he was the one being punished. By morning, my fear had turned into something more useful. Curiosity. If Damien expected me to learn the house, then I would learn everything I could before anyone decided I knew too much. Elena met me at breakfast in a pale gray dress and an expression that somehow managed to be kind and unreadable at the same time. She showed me the dining room, the library, the sitting room, the terrace, and the hallway that led toward Damien's private office. She did not say not to go there. She only paused half a beat too long while passing it, which told me more than a warning would have. The penthouse ran like a place built on invisible lines. Staff moved quietly and never lingered. Security came and went without making a show of it. Phones rang in distant rooms and were answered before a second chime. No one rushed, but everything happened on time. By noon, I understood the first real rule of Damien Moretti's world. Control did not come from chaos. It came from precision. At lunch, I met Marco, who seemed to handle the business side of the house and wore expensive watches like they were part of his body. He smiled too quickly and asked me whether I was settling in, but his eyes were not friendly. They were assessing. I told him I was learning. He said that was smart. Then he added that some people confused comfort with permission. It sounded polite, but the message was clear enough. This place had levels, and I was at the bottom no matter how nice my room looked. Later that afternoon, while Elena was on a call and most of the staff had drifted toward the service wing, I found myself near the library with the doors cracked just enough to hear voices carrying from the office beyond it. I should have walked away. Instead, I stood still, hidden by a shelf of first editions I doubted anyone in that house had ever read for pleasure. Marco was inside with Damien, and whatever mask he wore in public had slipped. He was arguing in a low, controlled voice about timing, loyalty, and a meeting uptown that should have been handled differently. Damien did not raise his voice once. That was what made the exchange so revealing. Marco pushed. Damien did not react. Marco implied that someone in the organization was becoming a liability. Damien replied that disloyalty usually sounded most confident right before it exposed itself. Silence followed, sharp and heavy. Then Marco laughed, but there was no warmth in it. He said trust was expensive in this city. Damien answered that betrayal was more expensive. I felt my pulse kick once, hard enough to make me step back from the shelf. In that single moment, the whole perfect penthouse shifted shape. It was not just a sanctuary. It was a chessboard. And for the first time since I arrived, I understood something that changed everything. Damien Moretti was powerful, yes, but his world was not unbreakable. It had pressure lines running through it, quiet ones, dangerous ones, and if I was careful enough, I might live long enough to learn exactly where they were. By the end of the first week, I understood that nobody in Damien Moretti's world ever said exactly what they meant unless they wanted you to know they had already won. Everything important lived in pauses, in glances, in who was invited into a room and who was left standing outside the door. So I stopped wasting energy wishing I were somewhere else and started paying attention to the details everyone assumed I was too overwhelmed to notice. Elena told me when breakfast was served, but I noticed Damien almost never ate before 8:30 unless he had a meeting. Marco liked to arrive early and act like he had been waiting on everyone else, which meant he cared more about appearances than patience. The security team rotated every 12 hours, but one of them, a former Marine named Owen, always checked the terrace doors himself before sunset, which told me routines mattered here more than rank. The staff did not gossip in the open, but I learned that silence had patterns too. On mornings when Damien was in the penthouse, the house felt tighter, cleaner, more exact. On mornings when he left before sunrise, people breathed easier even if nobody admitted why. It was not fear exactly. It was gravity. He did not need to raise his voice to pull every orbit closer to him. And that, more than money or reputation, was what made him dangerous. He could shape the entire mood of a room without touching a single thing. The surprising part was that he rarely paid much attention to me, at least not in the obvious ways. He did not summon me for pointless conversations. He did not hover. He did not try to charm me into accepting my place. Instead, he let me exist at the edges of his world, just close enough to observe it, just far enough to make me wonder whether that distance was deliberate. At first, I thought he had forgotten about me the way powerful men forget about anything that does not challenge them. Then, on the 9th day, I realized he had been watching more than I knew. I was in the library with a financial newspaper spread open in front of me, pretending to skim headlines while really trying to decode the house through the names I had heard in passing. Shipping companies, real estate groups, a charitable foundation with Damien's last name on the board, legal businesses, polished and public, stitched together like a respectable suit over something much harder underneath. I did not hear him come in. 1 second I was alone, and the next his reflection appeared in the dark glass of the window beside the shelves. He asked if I always studied people's empires by starting with their press coverage. I should have been embarrassed, but something in his tone told me that lying would be an insult. So I closed the paper and told him that newspapers were easier to trust than people. That made the corner of his mouth shift. Not quite a smile, but close enough to change the whole room. He stepped farther in, jacket off, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, looking less like a boss in that moment and more like a man who had been carrying too many decisions since dawn. He picked up the paper, glanced at the page I had folded back, and said most people saw money when they looked at those companies. He asked what I saw. I told him I saw insulation, layers, distance between the truth and the version the city preferred to live with. This time he did smile, brief and sharp, like he appreciated the answer against his better judgment. Then he said something that stayed with me long after he left. He said, "Underestimation is useful if you know how to live inside it." At first I thought it was a warning. Later I understood it was also advice. From that day on, I stopped trying to figure out how to escape the penthouse and started asking a different question. If everyone in this world had already decided what I was, then what could I become while they were busy being wrong? I began staying in shared rooms longer, reading what people left behind, noticing which names made Marco tense and which calls made Damien go quiet. And somewhere in that shift, something changed inside me. I was not just surviving his world anymore. I was learning its language. And the more fluent I became, the more I started to suspect that Damien was letting me. The first real advantage I ever gained in Damien Moretti's world came from something so ordinary that nobody else bothered to notice it. Rain. It had been falling since late afternoon, turning the windows into sheets of moving gray and making the entire penthouse feel quieter than usual, like the city outside had been wrapped in thick cotton. Meetings ran longer on days like that. Calls stretched out. Drivers were delayed. People arrived with damp shoulders and shorter tempers, which meant they made mistakes. I had learned that much already. What I had not expected was that one of those mistakes would happen right in front of me. Elena had asked me to bring a folder from the sitting room to the study because the assistants were tied up downstairs preparing for guests. She said it casually, as if handing me paperwork was no different from asking me to pass the salt. Maybe in that moment it was not. Maybe she trusted me more than she meant to. Or maybe she had simply stopped seeing me as temporary. Either way, I took the folder and walked toward the study with enough confidence to look like I belonged in the hallway. The door was half open. I could hear Damien inside on the phone, his voice low and steady, speaking in the same measured tone he used when everyone else in the room sounded half a step from panic. I should have left the folder with one of the staff outside. I knew that. But then I heard Marco's name, followed by 3 others I recognized from newspapers and overheard meetings, and my feet stopped moving before my mind had time to argue with them. Damien was not angry. That was the part that caught my attention. He sounded disappointed, which in his world was probably worse. He said the numbers had already been moved twice, that someone assumed he did not compare internal reports against the charitable side, and that assumption was going to cost the wrong person a great deal of influence. I did not understand all of it, but I understood enough. Money was being hidden in plain sight, diverted through one of the clean public branches of his empire, and Damien had just discovered the trail. A second later, the floorboard beneath my heel gave a soft click. It was barely a sound, but in a room that quiet it might as well have been thunder. The call ended immediately. I had just enough time to place the folder on the console table before Damien stepped into the doorway and found me there with the rain at my back and a lie forming too slowly on my face. He looked from the folder to me and then to the open door as if reconstructing the exact number of seconds I had been standing there. My pulse kicked so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I had learned enough by then to know that panic only made people easier to control. So I met his gaze and told the truth, or at least the part of it that could survive the room. I said Elena asked me to bring the file. The door was open, and I heard enough to know I should not have. For a long second he said nothing. Then he surprised me by stepping aside and telling me to come in. The study was warm, lined with dark shelves and lit by 2 brass lamps that made the rain-streaked city beyond the windows look even colder. Damien closed the door, not dramatically, just quietly enough to remind me that privacy here was never accidental. He asked me what I thought I had heard. It felt like a trap, but not the kind built to humiliate me. The kind built to measure me. So I told him what I had pieced together. Someone had been moving money through one of the legitimate entities because they assumed the respectable side would draw less scrutiny. Someone close enough to understand the system had also been arrogant enough to think small discrepancies would disappear under larger numbers. Damien listened with an expression so unreadable it made every word feel like a risk. When I finished, he walked to his desk, opened the folder I had brought, and pulled out a thin ledger tucked beneath the top document as if he had known it was there all along. He set it in front of me without touching the pages again. The entries were neat, coded, and boring enough to fool anyone who did not know what they were looking for. But I did. The dates mirrored the pattern he had just mentioned. The transfers lined up with names I had already heard in the house. And hidden inside all that dry accounting language was something more valuable than cash. Proof. Proof that someone inside his circle had been quietly building leverage against him. I looked up at Damien, and for the first time since the garage, I saw something in his eyes that felt almost like approval. Not warmth. Not trust. Recognition. He had not invited me into the room because I happened to be there. He had invited me because he wanted to see whether I could understand the weapon sitting on his desk. And when he asked me, very softly, who I thought stood to benefit most from the missing money, I realized the most dangerous thing about that night was not the secret ledger itself. It was that Damien Moretti had just handed me a piece of his war and waited to see what I would do with it. The moment Damien asked for my opinion, the room changed in a way I could feel more than explain. Until then, I had been an observer with good instincts, a quiet problem he had chosen not to solve. But asking me to name a threat inside his own circle was different. It pulled me across a line neither of us could pretend not to see. I looked back down at the ledger, forcing myself to breathe slowly enough that my voice would come out steady. The names were not written in plain English, but patterns rarely needed full introductions. Transfers moved through shell companies tied to one charitable branch, then folded back into shipping and real estate holdings before disappearing into accounts that looked too small to matter. Small enough to ignore. Small enough to repeat. The person behind it was not trying to get rich overnight. They were building something quieter. Independence. Influence. A backup plan. I told Damien that the theft did not look reckless. It looked patient, which meant the person responsible believed they had time. And people only believe they have time when they think they are either invisible or protected. Damien leaned against the edge of the desk with his sleeves rolled up and his face unreadable, but I could tell by the stillness in him that he was listening carefully. He asked me who inside the house liked to look important more than he liked to stay invisible. Marco. The answer came too fast in my head, but I did not say it right away. Accusing the wrong person in that room would have been the same as announcing I had misunderstood everything. So I chose my words the way he chose his, clean and measured. I said the person moving money wanted access to public-facing operations, enough confidence to work around internal reviews, and enough vanity to believe they were smarter than the system. I added that arrogance usually leaves fingerprints long before panic does. That was when Damien gave me a look I had never seen from him before, direct and almost curious, like he had expected intelligence but had not predicted how naturally I would fit it into his world. He asked where I learned to read people that way. I almost laughed, because the answer was not glamorous. I learned from growing up with adults who lied for sport and called it survival. I learned from watching men make selfish choices and then dress them up like sacrifice. I learned from being underestimated by people who assumed silence meant innocence instead of memory. I said only part of that out loud. I told him that when you spend enough years around desperate people, you start recognizing the difference between fear and ambition. For the first time, Damien did not answer right away. He looked at me like he was adjusting an internal calculation. Then he closed the ledger and said Marco had been with him a long time, which was not a defense so much as a warning about how deep betrayal could reach. I should have stopped there. I should have let the moment end with measured distance still intact. Instead, I asked the question that had been growing in me ever since the garage. I asked whether he ever trusted anyone completely. The silence after that felt sharp enough to cut paper. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows, and somewhere down the hall a phone rang once before going quiet. Damien walked past me to the bar cart, poured a finger of sparkling water over ice, and said trust was not a permanent condition. It was a moving number. People rose to meet it or fell beneath it. Then he handed me the glass instead of keeping it for himself, a small gesture that should not have mattered and yet did. Because nothing in his world was casual. Not distance. Not generosity. Not who got offered a place to stand when everyone else was told where to sit. Over the next week, that shift followed us into everything. He started asking for me at breakfast if a major meeting was expected later in the day. He left documents in the library that I suspected were not left there by accident. Once, when a call from Chicago ended with him staring out at the river longer than usual, he asked what I would do if two men on the same side wanted the same future. I told him one of them would eventually stop pretending they were on the same side. That answer made him exhale through a smile too brief to soften anything. The staff noticed the change before I admitted it to myself. Elena became gentler with her warnings. Owen stopped watching me like I might bolt. Marco, on the other hand, grew smoother in a way that made my skin tighten whenever he entered a room. He complimented my taste in books. He asked whether Manhattan was starting to feel like home. He pretended not to mind that Damien now listened when I spoke. And that was how I knew he minded very much. The dangerous part was not that Damien trusted me more. It was that I had started to trust my place beside him. Not completely, not foolishly, but enough to forget that every step closer to power also brought me closer to the truth. And I found that truth 2 nights later in a locked cabinet in the study, hidden inside old Foundation records and legal correspondence that should have meant nothing to me. Buried under tax statements and donor lists was my mother's name, Caroline Carter, printed on a letter dated 11 years earlier beside the signature of a law firm now tied to one of Damien's public companies. I stared at it so long the words lost shape. My mother had died when I was 13. I had spent half my life believing her collapse was just a private family tragedy swallowed by bad luck and worse timing. But her name was in Damien Moretti's world years before mine ever was. And as I stood there with the paper trembling in my hand and footsteps approaching from the hallway, I realized the worst part of being brought into his empire was not that he had changed my future. It was that he might have been connected to my past all along. I had less than 3 seconds to hide the letter before the footsteps reached the study door, and in Damien Moretti's world, 3 seconds was enough time to save yourself or destroy everything. I slid the paper back into the Foundation file, closed the cabinet, and crossed to the desk just as the door opened behind me. It was Damien. He stopped when he saw me standing there with one hand resting near the lamp, my pulse still racing so hard I was certain he could hear it. For one terrible second I thought he would know. Not because the cabinet was open or the files were disturbed, but because Damien noticed shifts in people the way other men noticed weather. He looked at me, then at the glass of water half finished on his desk, then back at me again. He asked if I had been looking for him. It was such an ordinary question that it almost broke me. I said I could not sleep. That much was true. He studied me for a beat longer, then stepped inside and closed the door with quiet precision. The city behind him was all silver lights and black sky, the East River moving like a dark ribbon between towers. He asked whether something had happened. What I wanted to say was that everything had happened, that my dead mother's name had just surfaced in the center of his polished empire, that the man who had started to feel like the only honest force in my life might have been tied to the oldest wound I carried. Instead, I did the only thing survival had ever taught me to do well. I gave away nothing I could not afford to lose. I told him the house had started feeling too quiet, and that sometimes silence made old memories louder. The answer was vague enough to protect me and honest enough to satisfy him, or at least to make him let the moment pass. He nodded once and poured himself water from the crystal carafe by the window, but he did not tell me to leave. That was the dangerous thing about Damien. He knew when to press and when to wait, and sometimes waiting gave him more power than any direct question could. I left the study with my face calm and my thoughts in ruins. The next morning, I began doing what I should have done the second I found my mother's name in those files. I started building my own map, not of the penthouse, not of Damien's business interests, of loyalties. If my mother's past touched this world, then the answer would not live in a single letter. It would live in people who had been around long enough to remember what everybody else had learned to bury. Marco was the obvious threat, but I had stopped believing the obvious story a long time ago. Men like Marco made noise because they wanted credit. Real damage usually came from the people who looked useful, patient, forgettable. So I widened my attention. I listened when the house manager spoke to drivers. I noticed which old names made the senior staff go still. I asked Elena harmless questions about how long certain people had worked for the family, and I learned that some had been around for more than a decade, crossing over from Damien's father's time into Damien's own reign. That mattered. So did the fact that two of those names appeared in the foundation records beside the law firm connected to my mother. Nothing direct, nothing that could stand in a courtroom, but enough to tell me that the thread was real. By the end of that week, I had also confirmed something else. Marco was not just hiding money. He was building relationships around Damien's blind spots, quiet lunches, private calls, polished deference in public and subtle pressure in private. He was preparing for a future in which Damien's authority no longer sat alone at the top. The smartest part was that he was not making one big move. He was making 100 small ones, the kind people dismissed until those pieces suddenly connected into a new shape. What Marco did not understand was that he was no longer the only one collecting patterns. Once I saw how the internal alliances bent under pressure, I stopped thinking like a guest in Damien's home and started thinking like an architect studying the load-bearing walls of a building. Owen respected loyalty more than charm. Elena valued order and hated unnecessary cruelty, which told me she would side with stability over ego. Two of the finance men who came through the penthouse every Thursday deferred to Marco in public but watched Damien when decisions became final, as if they still trusted power more than ambition. None of them needed to love me. They only needed to underestimate me long enough for me to become useful in the right direction. So I let them. I stayed calm. I stayed observant. I let Marco think his smooth questions unsettled me. I let Damien think I was still adapting to a world he had invited me into. The truth was far more dangerous. I was no longer adapting. I was arranging. Every conversation became a measurement. Every dinner became a test. Every silence became a place to hide a choice someone else did not know I had made. Then the opening came from the last place I expected. Damien left for a meeting in Midtown, and Marco stayed behind to coordinate calls from the penthouse. He was in the study with the door open, talking to someone in a tone so polished it almost disguised the urgency beneath it. He said the board would shift after the fundraiser, that the old names were already leaning, and that Damien still had not realized how isolated he was becoming. Then he laughed softly and said the girl was a distraction, nothing more. I stood frozen in the hallway, not because the insult mattered, but because the rest of it did. The fundraiser, the board, old names leaning. It was bigger than theft, Marco was planning to break Damien's influence from the inside using public legitimacy, private leverage, and just enough internal support to make it look inevitable. And in that instant, with the city humming far below and my mother's name still burning at the back of my mind, I understood exactly what I had to do. I was not going to expose Marco right away. Exposure would make him scramble, and scrambling men covered their tracks. I was going to let him believe his plan was working. I was going to let him move every piece into place while I quietly learned who was willing to follow him and why. Because the fastest way to destroy a betrayal is not to interrupt it. It is to let it reveal everyone involved. And as I turned away from the study before he could see me there, I realized the next phase of this story was no longer about surviving Damien's empire or even understanding it. It was about breaking the right parts of it open so I could finally see who had been standing behind the curtain all along. The fundraiser was held in a restored limestone building on the Upper East Side, the kind of place where old money liked to pretend it was still the only kind that mattered. Crystal chandeliers hung above rooms full of tailored suits, polished smiles, and women in silk dresses moving through conversations that sounded charitable on the surface and strategic underneath. Damien stood at the center of it all exactly the way he stood at the center of everything else, calm, composed, impossible to read unless you had spent long enough learning the difference between his silence and everyone else's. 3 months earlier, I would have looked at that room and seen power as something fixed, something inherited or purchased or enforced by people born knowing how to hold it. By that night, I knew better. Power was rarely fixed. It was negotiated every minute by whoever understood the room fastest. And for the first time in my life, that person was me. I arrived on Damien's arm because that was what everyone expected, but I did not walk into that ballroom as an ornament or a rumor. I walked in carrying the full weight of everything I had learned: Marco's quiet alliances, the missing money, the names buried in foundation records, the old loyalties bending toward whichever future looked safest. I had spent the last 10 days doing exactly what Marco had not realized anyone else was capable of. I let people talk around me. I let them assume I was still too new, too sheltered, too emotionally tangled in Damien to understand the machinery beneath the surface. And while they dismissed me, I connected every last moving part. The 2 board members Marco thought were privately committed to him were not loyal to Marco at all. They were loyal to continuity, and continuity only mattered if someone could prove Damien's judgment was compromised. The Foundation Council who signed the old documents tied to my mother had not worked alone. He had been acting under pressure from Damien's father and 2 senior advisors who wanted certain liabilities pushed out of public sight before a merger more than a decade earlier. Damien had inherited the structure, the names, the public-facing institutions, but not every secret buried inside them. That truth mattered more than revenge because it changed the shape of guilt. Damien was connected to my past, yes, but not in the way I had feared. He had been born into an empire already built with hidden fractures, and Marco had spent years learning exactly which ones to widen. The plan that night was elegant in the ugliest way. During the Foundation Board review after dinner, Marco intended to raise concerns about irregular transfers and suggest that Damien's attention had been compromised by personal distractions and internal blind spots. He would sound reluctant, responsible. He would frame himself as the man trying to preserve the family's public future while Damien clung to a private one. In another world, it might have worked. But Marco made one fatal mistake. He thought only he understood how to weaponize appearances. So I let the evening move right up to the edge of his betrayal. I let the speeches finish. I let the donors smile for photographs under the chandeliers. I let the board gather in the private reception room upstairs with its gilded mirrors and dark velvet chairs, and the skyline glowing through windows tall enough to make everyone feel important. Then, just before Marco began, I asked to speak. The room stilled in that subtle, immediate way powerful rooms do when something unexpected enters them. Marco looked annoyed for half a second before smoothing it over. Damien turned toward me, and in his face I saw the same careful stillness from the penthouse 3 months earlier, the look of a man who knew something decisive was coming and had chosen, for reasons only he understood, not to stop it. I said I had been reviewing Foundation records because Damien believed transparency mattered more than comfort. That line alone shifted the room. It tied my presence to his judgment rather than his weakness. Then I laid out what Marco had hoped to reveal, but I did it cleaner. I spoke about the layered transfers through charitable and real estate accounts. I named the timing, the internal approvals, the pattern of influence building hidden beneath respectable paperwork. I did not accuse wildly. I did not dramatize. I simply made the structure visible, one link at a time, until the men who had planned to nod along with Marco were staring at him instead. When he tried to interrupt, I added the old names, the legacy pressure points, the archived signatures, the advisors from Damien's father's era who had created a paper trail strong enough to manipulate, but weak enough to deny. I made it clear that Marco had not invented corruption. He had inherited it, studied it, and chosen to use it as a ladder. That was the moment the room stopped being his. Because betrayal loses half its power when someone explains it before the traitor gets the chance. Marco's face changed first, then the board's, then the senior staff standing near the door. Owen looked at Damien. Elena looked at me. One of the finance men who had always deferred to Marco lowered his eyes like he had just realized the wrong future had been promised to him. No one shouted. No one needed to. In rooms like that, the deepest humiliation comes in silence. When people start rearranging their loyalties in real time, and you can feel the air leaving your version of the story. Marco tried one last move. He said I was emotional, manipulated, out of my depth. He said Damien had put too much faith in someone who did not understand what this world required. That was when Damien finally spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, just with enough finality to cut through every excuse still hanging in the room. He said, "She understands it better than you did." After that, the room belonged to gravity again. Only this time it had shifted directions. The board did not remove Damien. They closed ranks around him because instability frightened them more than scandal. And I had handed them a version of stability that still looked disciplined, still looked salvageable, still looked expensive enough to trust. Marco was not dragged out in disgrace. That would have been too simple, too theatrical. He was done the more dangerous way, by losing the room, the numbers, the confidence, and the illusion that he had been inevitable. By the time we returned to the penthouse after midnight, the city looked the same from 63 floors up, but nothing inside that glass had the same shape. The staff moved differently around me. The silence felt different. Even Damien felt different, as if some private line he had been holding for years had finally snapped, or maybe finally relaxed. He dismissed everyone with a glance and stood with me alone in the great room where the river flashed silver beyond the windows. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he crossed the marble floor and lowered himself onto one knee in front of me, not like a man surrendering, not like a man broken, but like a man making the most honest acknowledgement of his life. He said I had taken a house built to contain me and turned it into something else entirely. He said power did not belong to the person who claimed it first. It belonged to the person who could hold it when the room changed. I looked down at him and thought about the garage, the rain, my mother's name buried in old files, the nights I had spent teaching myself not to flinch when doors opened. I thought about how everyone had assumed my story began the night I was traded into his world, when really it began the moment I decided not to let that world define me. And as the whole empire held its breath beyond those walls, I understood the final truth neither of us had spoken until then. Damien Moretti may have once had the power to take my future, but I had become the woman who could decide what happened to his.